Hello guys, welcome to another video. In this one I wanted to do a bit of Theorycraft on the different avenues you can go down with the Righteous Fire Bodyswap Chieftain build, which is a league starter that I've been testing a little bit for Path of Exile's upcoming 3.24 league. And if you missed my first video about this build, you can check it out here. That video kind of gives a bit of overview to the build, goes through my thought process for testing that particular setup. And this video is more of a Theorycraft for what you can expect from the build and its kind of strengths and weaknesses and how you can progress that build into the late game stage. So here is a tree. This is level 94 at the moment, so it's not that late into progression, but I wanted to kind of do a bit of expectation of what this build can actually get to. And one thing that I want to kind of mention right at the start of this video is kind of dispel the illusion that this build is going to be very good for bossing, because that is not the case. This is definitely not a bosser. It is a pure mapping build. It's not going to be very good for bossing at all. That doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to kind of progress the Atlas and get your 4 watchstones. You know, you'll be able to do that, but don't expect to be farming bosses with this build. It's not going to be a very fun time farming bosses, but it is going to be very fun for mapping, which is where this build is going to excel. So this setup that I've put together here is kind of like just a bit of an idea of what you could do with the build. So one thing that I want to discuss right at the start here is the maximum resistances, because early on in progression, you're going to be using Rise of the Phoenix. And I think even if you're playing SSF, you know, if you don't get lucky and drop this, you can always farm the Divination card for it. It's quite an easy shield to get. And in Trade League, you're going to want to pick up this really early on. It's just so good on Chieftain. As soon as you get to maps and you grab the Valaco Notable, you want to be using Rise of the Phoenix. It's going to help you sustain RF, and of course going to reduce the damage you take from all elemental damage massively. And you can reach 90 res really early on Chieftain with this shield. However, later on in progression, when you want to kind of move into more of a fizz damage taken as other damage types setup, we're going to want to use Dawnbreaker. So that's what this build is using right now. And you're going to want to aim for as much physical damage taken as fire damage as possible on the Dawnbreaker shield. So when you do switch over to Dawnbreaker, you're going to need to get your maximum fire resistance from somewhere else. So we are going to be using Purity of Fire from the get-go, but this is where you're going to want to get Purity of Fire to level 21 so that it has 5% additional maximum fire resistance. That comes from it being at level 23 when it's socketed into an item that grants gem levels. And this is a glove setup here. It just has the unveiled Betrayal mod for +2 to level of socketed AoE gems. And you can get gem levels elsewhere on this build. For example, you could get a gem level coming in from an amulet. You could get one coming in from your weapon. But as long as you get that to level 23, then it will provide +5% to maximum fire resistance. And this is actually granting us 7% because we have 40% aura effect. So I'll just quickly show where that aura effect is coming from. There's 6% here from this small node, and then another 10% from sovereignty, another 10% from the mastery here, and then there's a cluster setup here, and this is another 10% here from introspection. And the anoint on the amulet here is allocating charisma, which is the remaining aura effect there. So that boosts it up just over 40%, and that means that we're getting 7% coming in from Purity of Fire. And then we have 3% coming in from this wheel down here, so 1% and 2% from Prismatic Skin, another 1% from Barbarism, and the remaining 4%, 2% comes from Molten One's Mark. That's a small cluster jewel notable from the fire resistance clusters. And the last 2% comes from the Searing Exarch implicit on the boots. This one is a little bit more difficult to get. You're going to need to spend some currency to get that. Especially in like an SSF environment, it's going to be a bit more difficult to get. But even getting 1% on this is fine. Same with the aura effect. Like, it's fine if you sit around 89% early on. But you're going to want to push for that 90% later on with better gear. So, as I mentioned, the reason why we want to move away from Rise of the Phoenix is so that we can go for more of a full conversion setup. So we take all that physical damage as other damage types. that begins with Dawnbreaker. As I mentioned, you want to aim for a high roll on the Fizz taken as fire. The other rolls are quite important. I'll explain those later, but you know, if it happens that you just get a 20% or a 19% Fizz taken as fire and the other rolls are really bad, that doesn't really matter too much. And then we're also using Cloak of Flame for another 40% of Fizz damage taken as fire. Both of these affect damage over time as well, so it's going to be really nice against bleeding, corrupted blood, and any other Fizz dots. And 8% comes from the crafted Corel modifier on the helmet there. And in this setup, I'm also using a Watcher's Eye Jewel for 10% of physical damage from hits taken as fire damage while affected by Purity of Fire. And I'm also using the Armour and Energy Shield Mastery for 10% of physical damage from hits taken as Chaos damage. So that's going to get you to around 90% of physical damage from hits taken as different damage types. Mostly as fire, a little bit of Chaos. And that's going to massively improve the Fizz max hit, because we don't want to use Determination anymore in this setup. We want to kind of make way for a bit more damage, so we're using Malevolence here. Speaking of those other rolls on Dawnbreaker, we're making use of Tempered by War in this setup. You may have seen this in the Lategame video that I did where I broke down Lategame's Gauntlet build, and he was using this setup with Tempered by War, and Dawnbreaker is very, very strong against damage penetration, things like Shapeable, stuff like that. But in this build, we're using it for a bit of a different reason, actually. So Tempered by War with Dawnbreaker is going to allow a bunch of that damage that's being taken as cold and lightning to be taken as fire damage. This also affects damage over time. But the reason why we're using this is because we're using Arctic Armour, something that I should have mentioned in the last video, because this is actually a huge defensive layer of this build. Because we're playing body swap and we're very often stationary, kind of blinking around and staying stationary, Arctic Armour is really strong defensively. It provides 21% less physical damage and 20% less fire damage taken from hits while stationary. So the physical damage component is not that relevant once we have this kind of full damage taken as setup going on. But the fire damage is really important, because all of the fire damage that we take is going to be lessened by this when we're stationary, which is going to be most of the time. And a lot of the cold and lightning damage that we take is also being taken as fire damage, and that portion is also going to be lessened by that Arctic Armour modifier. So that's a really, really powerful defensive setup there. And the downside of Tempered by War, the less cold and lightning resistance, is it is relevant. It is a thing that you kind of have to overcome, but Chieftain definitely outgears this with the Tasadio notable. This notable just makes it so easy to outgear this. You just can fully focus on fire resistance. You can see most of the gear that I have here is just fire resistance roll with the crafted Betrayal, Fire and Chaos mod. This helmet here is an Elder Helm for the Righteous Fire setup, so that it's more of a 6-link, and it's just one essence of horror on there. You hit the burning damage modifier, and then you're going to lock suffixes, and you're going to either Veiled Chaos or Ashling that to get the Unveiled Life modifier, and then you craft on the 8% of physical damage from hits taken as fire damage. That's a Corel Betrayal modifier there as well, so not too difficult to craft that helmet. So most of this gear is pretty straightforward, I would say. It's not that difficult to acquire, and obviously you can get much better gear than this. This is kind of a bit of a theory crafting, seeing what is possible. And I'm also using a cluster setup here at the top of the tree. Most of this is damage. This is kind of a lot of damage, a little bit of life here, and Wrapped in Flame is being used here. That's really nice, so we can't be chilled. So this setup is, I wouldn't say it's fully necessary early on. Like, obviously we're gaining max resistance here, we're gaining some aura effects. So this right here is a total of 3% max fire res, because there's the aura effects coming in here, which allows us to reach 40%, and then there's these 2% here. So these things are really nice, but early on you can kind of skip out this. It doesn't really matter too much, but you're going to be wanting to aim for this later on, because this is also a lot of value for the points spent for the amount of damage that you gain. And one last thing that I'll mention is Desecrate. Because this build kind of lacks damage for single target, you're going to want to include Desecrate in the build. So all you have to do is just grab a few of the high life spectres from the campaign. You can get like a Katava's Herald or Auric Champion, Auric Colossus, those sort of things. And once you've raised those spectres, you can get rid of the gem. And then you just level up a Desecrate to level 20. And you're basically barely going to use Desecrate. While you're mapping, you're going to just be blinking around, everything's going to be exploding. But occasionally, you'll reach a really tanky rare that you just can't deal with because it's got too much life. You can drop Desecrate down and use Bodyswap to explode one of the raised Spectre corpses that Desecrate summons. And that's going to massively improve the ignite damage there that you deal. And that's a nice addition to the build. There is a little bit of socket pressure in this build. Like, you could use an unset ring and put Desecrate in the unset ring, and that would mean that you can use Arcanist Brand in the Punishment and Flame Surge link, but Desecrate's there is useful for dealing a little bit more damage. Yeah, that's about it for the Theorycraft for this build for like a late game setup. I think that if I do league start this build, and I'm strongly considering it right now, my plan is to basically just progress the Atlas, push the Atlas pretty hard early on with this build. I think it's going to be really, really nice for pushing the Atlas and progressing through all of that map completion and the Maven invites and things. Maven invites, by the way, I think with this build are going to be really nice because you have a lot of high health, tanky targets in there, like 10 ways, for example. As soon as you kind of get one of those corpses down, you can just use that corpse to ignite all of the other enemies, and they're just going to all melt from that. So that's a really nice way that this build can deal with those. And I think progressing the Atlas is going to be really comfortable with this build, and then I'll move on to making more of a sort of bossing character or something like that. But yeah, that's going to be it for this video, guys. I will be doing an update on the actual kind of progression of the test build and talking about my experiences with it a little bit later on. And if you want to support the growth of this channel, you can by heading over to a Patreon that I've set up. The link is in the description below. Shout out to Exalted supporter Acid Bath 101 for your support. Thank you. And thanks for watching this video. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.